Welcome back, Five-Aiders.
Hit the button.
All right, here we go.
Recording in progress.
Here we go. We started. Ladies and gentlemen, we have him. We have the source, the architect, the inventor of mRNA technology, Dr. Robert Malone.
Thank you. You're too kind.
Dr. Robert Malone, thank you so much for being here. It is a pleasure to have you on the 5-8 Take, and a lot of our listeners have been waiting for this moment. Hopefully you can clarify a lot of things for us and light a fire under some of our politicians, hit them with some science and some data that will actually make some sense, because nothing's making sense right now. We started talking via Twitter, so I thought it's only right that we start this off with a tweet of yours. So you So you tweeted, "To those that think I am posting due to my political bias, news for you. It is because of my upbringing. I was taught not to lie, and I got fed up with the lies, misrepresentations, obfuscation, censorship, and imbecilic fact-checking. I actually donated to the Biden campaign." So my question that I have for you, Dr. Malone, do you regret donating to the Biden campaign?
So you were the one that was asking that question.
No.
Actually, I do. I do now.
You do? I was going to go back to the upbringing and taught not to lie, but if you want to unpack that.
Well, I try not to lie, and that's part of my thing is to call it straight. I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We have hopes and fears, and so do I. I'm just human, just same as you. And although I don't have a gold medal in jiu-jitsu, so I'm afraid that...
No, you excel way beyond in a lot of things. So that's...
but we all put our pants on, right? And
that's true.
So I had hopes with the election, and I overlooked. We had a very limited spectrum of options in the end, and the cynics might say that both parties are remarkably similar. They put on. I live close to DC because I have to work with DC. Mm-hmm. And I understand DC politics, and I've spent time on the Hill talking to legislators. And even in this current, I can say to the Aussies, I even had a good long chat with some senior staff in Nancy Pelosi's office, who is the Speaker of the House, about my concerns about these vaccines and how the CDC was managing the situation. And I had high hopes for this administration, but over time, I'm getting more and more cynical about whether there really are substantive differences. A lot of the things that I was critical about for the Trump administration's management of this crisis, I'm kind of coming around to the opinion that the Biden administration's management has been even worse.
Right.
That's not a very pretty thing to say. And in terms of to get to the heart of the tweet and the topic, increasingly the term legacy media, as opposed to social media and the podcast community, which I've been brought into the podcast community consequent to that Dark Horse podcast with Brett Weinstein that's just gone super viral.
Yes.
And I had no idea when I was invited to go travel to Portland and be on Brett's broadcast. I really had no idea who Brett was, what the dark web was, what the podcasters were doing. I was completely naive about that world.
Not the dark web. We don't sit in a dark web. Not the dark web, I hope.
Well, as it's defined by folks like Brett,
yes.
The dark web is the space in between the two political parties.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, blockchain protected, QAnon, crazy world,
right.
In 4chan.
Yes.
It's defines this space of discussion and intellectual world that is neither left nor right.
Yes.
It's the interesting place, right? It's this space in between where where it's okay to discuss ideas like, back in the old days.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Before all the thought and ideas were all controlled. And so for me, that was a huge moment of an epiphany. It was a moment of epiphany that this forum and this media exists. What happened so to get to the tweet, I've been for whatever reason, conservative media has embraced me.
Yeah. And
which is rather odd because I have been lifelong progressive, grown up in the Central Coast of California, and I always had my own biases. I'd never watched Fox News. My father watched Fox News. He was totally indoctrinated by Fox News until the day of his death. It's all, and I wouldn't go there. And yet I've been on Glenn Beck, Tucker Carlson, and frequently on Steve Bannon's War Room. These are the people that want to discuss these issues. These are the people that these quote labeled conservatives are the ones that seem to care deeply about these issues having to do with personal freedom and rights. And for me, it's been a huge cognitive dissonance, intellectual paradox to try to make sense of what I'm seeing and experiencing. And if I can, probably to your audience, the name Glenn Beck may not mean anything, but he's a well-known conservative radio host, very conservative in the United States. And apparently he doesn't usually have guests on repeatedly. And he had me on, I think, 3 successive broadcasts for the span of over 3 hours. And at the end of it, he said to me, he would try to take me off into conservative conspiracy land from time to time. And I always kind of brought it back and didn't want to go there. But he said to me at the end, something profound. He said, Robert, I've really enjoyed these 3 sessions with you because everything you said was not about, you said it was not political. What you said was not political.
Yes.
And for Glenn Beck, who is, his brand is, fire-breathing conservative. And to say that was profound. And when he said it, it was one of these moments where I just kind of went, oh, there's something going on here that's different. And it's bothered me ever since. And I think that so another example along that, we have a guy here named Robert F. Kennedy Jr. People call him Bobby Kennedy.
Yes.
Okay. His father was assassinated. His uncle was assassinated. He fully believes that they were assassinated by the CIA. Okay. He is vaccine harmed. He can hardly speak in public because of the laryngospasm that he has that was probably consequent influenza vaccines. It's one of the common adverse events associated with influenza vaccination in the elderly, or in the adults, I should say. He's not elderly. Well, he is a little bit now. He's a little older than I am. He is also being embraced by the Republicans, which is a profound statement for a Kennedy, the bastion of liberalism, New England liberalism. For a Kennedy to be embraced by the Republicans and vice versa is a profound thing. And what I think I'm seeing is what could become a historic political realignment that is not left versus right. I'm trying to come to grips with it. People come with their different polls. Some people say it's good versus bad. There are those that think what's going on is truly evil. I think personally that the tension here is between collectivism and individual rights.
Yeah.
And that cuts across left versus right. That's different. You can be progressive and in favor of individual rights, and you can be right-wing and in favor of the collective in some way, although not so much.
It's similar to that phrase that gets toted around over here. It's think locally, but act globally.
I live it. Okay. So I absolutely live that reality.
Yeah.
I live in the metaphor here is red state and blue state, blue state being Democratic, red state being Republican. And I live in a purple state, Virginia. It's kind of on the edge. Robert E. Lee and the Army of the South and the Army of the North fought it out right through this valley that I live in, all the way down to Richmond. My great-great-great-grandfather got all shot to heck fighting the Northern troops defending Richmond. He was from Alabama.
Right.
So that's, but I grew up in California, so I was kind of outside of that whole world. But I live in a purple state in a red county. Okay, so I'm surrounded by pretty much card-carrying conservatives.
Right.
And I got to get along with everybody. And I don't have the luxury, I got to buy my hay for my horses. I got to go down to the feed store. I got to get along with everybody. And I'm absolutely committed to what you just said. To the extent possible, I hire local labor.
Yeah.
I buy from local companies. I do my business locally. I only if I have to do I go to Amazon or other large outside entities. I have the young lady that helps us manage the farm. Her whole family, extended family, live within about 10 miles of here. I think that logic of think globally and act locally and buy locally is super sound. And there are those kind of in your generation more here in the States that are getting fed up with a lot of what's going on. And they're creating these enclaves where they form cooperative buying units and buy land. And they're not communes, but they're setting up communities where they are able to, like many religious groups do, where they're able to live by their values and not have to be forced to comport with community norms that they don't feel comfortable with, let's say.
When I was reading that tweet, one particular line stood out to me, and that was, I was taught not to lie. And could you just unpack that a little bit? Because you seem to have not only a genius mind that you do have in developing the technology that you did and working in the field that you do and the leadership that you must have being in your position, but a very interesting past, as you've just mentioned just then, a historic one that allows you to see things from different perspectives. It allows you to sit down the center and not be conformed to either sides, whether you were in the past or whatever the case may be. It seems that like you've come to align to a center position. So when you say I was taught not to lie, what was instilled in you, do you believe, that allows you to sit in this center court and be absolutely as honest as possible within that space?
Well, that's an interesting question. As we were talking before you hit record, I live on the fifth small farm that my wife and I have rebuilt. I was a farmer and a carpenter before I was a physician and a scientist. I'm pretty good at shoeing horses and learned how to shoe horses on draft horses. I breed horses and run it as a business. It's not a hobby. I'm a pretty decent rider. In dressage world, I'm a level 3 rider. So I can't keep up with my stallion now. He's at level 4 and heading north. So we have to hire a really high-end trainer now, but that's the way it is. So like we were saying, I got 2 steel chainsaws, and both of them I've probably burned through 4 or 5 different bars already. I get out and mow the lawn with my 0-turn mower because we manage 50 acres. and I got a tractor and all that kind of stuff. So that does have a tendency to keep you grounded. Virology is actually a very old discipline.
Right.
And it's been around a long time, but it's a niche.
Yeah.
How did I get so fascinated by it? It goes back to my time as an undergraduate at University of California, Davis, which is arguably the top ag school in the nation.
Right.
So your friends there in Australia that are in the agriculture business will recognize the contribution of University of California, Davis to viticulture and enology. Those that are in milk production will recognize the contributions of UC Davis. Likewise, poultry, certainly equine and equine reproduction. So that's where I went to school and took a degree in biochemistry, which is a pretty hard degree. It's not chemical engineering, but it certainly burned me up. And I spent 2 years as a total bench rat in a laboratory that was focused on breast cancer and the role of mouse mammary tumor virus, which is a retrovirus in breast cancer. And while I was there, it just so happened that one of my 2 mentors, Murray Gardner was one and Robert Cardiff was the other. Right. Bob Cardiff is a hardcore pathologist he's one of the world's experts in the pathology of transgenic mouse models. So He's often used as a reference for that. And he had just come off of a fellowship sabbatical at UCSF in the laboratory, these 2 characters named Bishop and Varmus that had just received the Nobel Prize for discovering oncogenes. Right. And Murray Gardner, my other mentor, had been the founder of the Cancer Center at University of Southern California. And then he'd been recruited up to UC Davis. And the story goes, the reason they successfully recruited him was that his wife had a dream. She's stuck in LA, and she really wanted a farm with a red barn and a pond. And so because she wanted to do sheep and sheep wool and all that kind of stuff, something Aussies can appreciate.
Yes.
And so the story with Murray is they recruited him because they couldn't really afford to recruit him, but they found a farm with a red barn and a pond that she could have her sheep on. And that's how he came up. It's part of why I am who I am, frankly, and live the life that I do is because I had these role models of at this ag school, and particularly Murray Gardner, who combined living on a farm and being a world-class virologist, connected. So for instance, when I was an undergraduate, this guy named Luc Montagnier used to come to the lab from time to time. You may or may not recognize that Luc is a Nobel Prize winner for the discovery of HIV. When I was in the lab, these Murray and this guy named Preston Marks, who was a veterinary virologist, just found that there was an immunodeficiency syndrome in the monkeys at the Primate Research Center.
Right.
And they isolated the virus caused by this. I remember the lab meeting I can never forget the lab meeting when they showed the first electron micrographs of a retrovirus that caused immunodeficiency in primates. That was revolutionary. It was published in Lancet. It predated the discovery of the AIDS virus. And Murray actually traveled with Bob Gallo to the Pasteur. It's immortalized in an HBO film. I don't know if you guys get it down in Australia, called And the Band Played On. And Murray brought the virus back in his pocket, quite literally, through customs in the States. You wouldn't do that in Australia anymore, I guarantee. And I remember him. He was, for a guy that was in his early 60s, he was practically dancing down the halls when he came back from Paris and de Gaulle, saying, "I've got the virus that causes AIDS in my pocket." And so
that's fantastic.
That's a story. I mean, there was a major cat fight because Bob Gallo was claiming he'd isolated the virus first, but in fact, what he did was he re-isolated the virus that Murray and he had brought back from the Pasteur, and he claimed that he was the original discoverer. This was a multi-decade-long cat fight. And so this is what I grew up with. I mean, this is my formative years in my mid-20s, is this heady brew of, surrounded by veterinarians and primatologists and pathologists and virologists and working on vaccines for AIDS. And, my hero was a guy named Don Francis, who you may know played a key role. I mean, I was at Davis. San Francisco's just down the street. Murray was being. This is another fun story. I got so many stories about those days. Murray was brought in by the cat houses up in.
I love how your stories are just so globally impactful and they're just brilliant stories.
Murray, honest to God, back in the day, Murray was brought in as a consultant to the cat houses up in Nevada for how they should manage the risk of the ladies of the night practicing their trade in the days of AIDS. It was an amazing time. So this is what I grew up with, and all of the politics around that. I mean, the lab, there's a dark side to this too. Murray was threatened by Bob Gallo that he'd never get another grant if he kept working with the French virus. The laboratory was the first one to show that the isolate from San Francisco and the isolate from France and the isolate supposedly from Bob Gallo's lab, that the one from San Francisco was different. And the two that Bob and Luc Montagnier and colleagues believed that they had separately isolated were exactly the same virus. And there was a decision not to publish that because of the political implications. So this is, you ask, why viruses and farming and all of that all comes together. Well, I got to say, it's how I was brought up.
Yeah.
just like my mother who grew up on a sheep farm, honest to God, in Eastern Oregon, where they would run the sheep, up and down the hills, depending on the season for pasture. She grew up in a town that's now a ghost town, Western ghost town, and grew up with this kind of deep moral bedrock that comes from a rural background. I personally, I think that here in the States, we lost our soul a little bit when there was a decision in the 60s to, the term is used, get big or get out with farming. When Wall Street money came in, took over the farms, bought out the small farmer, and everybody went into debt to buy John Deere equipment, and you lost the small farm. And I think the small farm, in a lot of ways, was the beating heart of America and American innovation also. I'm partially influenced because I used to breed draft horses. We have this religious community here called the Amish. I don't know if you've got them in Australia.
Not as big as population, but yes. Yep.
And there are certain things they don't do. Everybody laughs at them because they think they're Luddites, and they don't drive around in cars. They have their own logic. But I can tell you, when you go onto a Amish farm, and they're the last people in the United States that understand how to make a small farm work. When you go onto an Amish farm, all the kids are working. Mm-hmm. Everybody has a job. It's very different. So you ask, why am I me? Because this is the world I choose to live in. I couldn't live in Manhattan.
It's amazing. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I couldn't live in Sydney.
No, trust me, mate. You would not want to be in Sydney right now. These lockdowns are horrible. There's sections of the city where essentially are called LGAs, where you can't go out for more than an hour's walk. Everyone in the city has to wear a mask. Our borders are closed. Families are being torn apart. Our suicide rate is actually nearly double the COVID deaths over here. I recall Brett Weinstein on the Joe Rogan Experience last June state that Americans should go into a strict lockdown. Well, Brett, I can tell you right now that is a horrible, horrible idea. The suicide rate is has a direct correlation to the lockdowns. Lockdowns are... I can't, and I don't understand why these politicians act this way. They can see that it doesn't work, and I just don't understand it.
I was just looking for the reference, and since you follow my Twitter account,
yes,
you'll find there's a major study there that will be very useful to you. Mm-hmm. That it's a major think tank study that looks at the economic impacts of lockdown and the logic of lockdown and the effect of lockdown on deaths in 40 different nations. And it comes to the clear and unequivocal conclusion that it is a very bad idea.
Yes. Yes.
So there's my gift to you. That's, I had been, you're not the first Aussie to contact me about this topic. Uh-huh. And so I sought that study out, and frankly, it's a gift to you and your colleagues. I wanted to make sure that you guys could download that. So the link is there.
I'll grab it and I'll put it out. I'll give it to our team to push that out as soon as possible. Now, I don't understand why, as you said, the data's right there. I look at the data as much as I can to make an analytical decision as to what to do. Right. And I respect everyone that makes that choice. But if we're looking at this data, why are they making the decisions that go against science, against these data? I just don't understand that.
All across the world, folks like you and me are looking at all these things and going, this just doesn't add up. What the heck is going on here? And let's speak about the Great Reset and the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and all that kind of stuff. I try to stay out of that because, I don't know anything about Klaus Schwab. I've never met him. Bill Gates doesn't call me over to his house. I've never been to Davos. I don't know these people. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what's in their heart or their soul or their brains or anything else. But what I do know is just what you just said. There's a whole lot of this doesn't make sense.
Yes, 100%. And as you mentioned earlier, those amazing mentors of yours, if only we could be so lucky, they did incredible things, not only for America, but for the rest of the world. And did you look up to them wanting to create something similar? Or did you just stumble upon mRNA technology? I believe you were 28 at the time.
Okay,
mate.
so,
when I was 28,
28,
I tell you right now, I'm not creating mRNA technology. That's a genius level as you are.
Well, that's kind. I really feel uncomfortable talking about these things generally.
Yeah. Why is that?
That's a good question. It's so egotistical. Just the same reason that I'm not comfortable talking about, people. I always almost thank you for not forcing me to go down what did you do that justifies you saying that you were the inventor, and establish your legitimacy. I thank you so much for not forcing me to do that for the, 50th time. I'm generally a modest person. I've never sought the attention.
Yeah.
I like to live a quiet life with my wife and my family, and it's by choice. I've seen how this insane quest for fame and fortune and immortality distorts people.
Yes.
I've seen it again and again and again. And I don't know how many times I've run into a senior professor that the words come out of their mouth, I only wish I'd spent more time with my kids. When they're older. And for some reason, my wife and I, maybe it's part of what brought us together, people talk about folks being old souls,
yes,
even when they're young.
Yes.
And we were kind of old souls. I had these odd drivers. I was born at the University Hospital in Stanford in the late 50s, at a time with Sputnik and all that kind of stuff, and the new emphasis on science and education in the United States. And I was the son of a school teacher and an electrical engineer trained at Stanford. And for them, it was all about the mind. And I was precocious, and they took me to be IQ tested at Stanford. I wouldn't wish this on anybody, frankly. Our grandson is very bright, and his mother was talking to us. He's 4 now. Yeah. Was talking to us when he was very young and saying, "Oh, look how he can say these words already and everything, and he's so brilliant." And I was like, "Megan, don't go there, okay? Don't put that burden on him, okay?" So I got IQ tested, and I was kind of off the charts. And then I got, all these expectations laid on me by my folks, and my mother in particular. And it's an odd situation. I don't mean to sound like I'm whining, but to be told, basically set up that if you don't win the Nobel Prize, you're a failure and you haven't met your expectations of your parents is a kind of a heavy thing. Tiger Mom hardly even scratches that. Now she's passed away, and so has my father, and they had their own special kind of crazy that as we all do. It took me a while. as we all families have their own special crazy, I think. Yes. And I'm not to say that we're perfect, but so I had all of that laid on me, and then I rebelled against it, and I became a rock climber and a hiker, and let's just say gently, I grew up in the 70s in the Central Coast of California, and leave it at that. If you follow what I'm saying, okay, right? Okay, and I rebelled against being the perfect son. Honest to God, in my bedroom, my parents painted red, white, and blue, and they were strong supporters of Richard Nixon and Goldwater before that. And I had a poster on the back of my door when I was a young teen that was a Richard Nixon campaign poster. That was, kind of where I came from. So I rebelled against that and met this young woman, 15 at the time, right when I came off of hiking the Muir Trail. So I did the Muir Trail when I was 15, and then came home deciding that what I needed was a good woman. At the tender age of 16.
The hike was that hard?
It's a pretty rigorous hike to knock off in 6 weeks. You start at Mount Whitney and you end up in
wanting a woman and to settle down.
Yeah, that was it. And I met this young woman, and we hit it off, and we both love horses. Amazing. And we got married. We eloped and lived in the hills below Lake Tahoe for a while, and so that's our story. We've kind of been together, and I was in construction, and you can find a link on my LinkedIn profile of this fantastic house that I built or helped build. I was foreman of the shingling crew, and it's considered an architectural masterpiece in Santa Barbara. It's an amazing thing to look at, but the shingles are all swirls, and it's an amazing structure. But after that, I kind of said to myself, do you want to spend the rest of your life hanging out with construction guys? And the answer was no, not really. And so I went back to school, and I was on fire. I just, I wanted to make something of myself. I won't tell you the context, but let's say I had an epiphany on New Year's Day, 1980. We'll leave it at that. And I just decided that, I didn't like the person I was. And I really wanted to do something with my life. And so that's what's driven me and drove me during that whole decade. It was so wicked hard to get into medical school that I just thought I had to prepare myself for an alternative career in biotechnology and all that, which was an emerging field. And I kind of overshot the goal, and I ended up with an MD PhD scholarship, and that's what set that road on. And then you'll appreciate, as an Aussie that grew up in Brazil, wife and I grew up in Santa Barbara, and I got into Northwestern in Chicago, and that was a pretty rough lesson in what winter really was. I got to tell you, living here by DC. The people that whine about the winter, I just got no sympathy for those folks anymore. But that's another part of the story. So that we kind of had to get out of Dodge with a young child living under those conditions and not having any money. I'm sure Chicago is a great place to live if you're rich, but I can tell you from first-person experience, it sucks to live there if you're poor.
It'd be freezing. It'd be freezing.
Oh, I'll never forget standing at the corner of Lakeshore Drive with that wind coming off of the lake, trying to catch a bus, or stomping up to the elevated train with the the smell of urine in both directions. It just is not my idea of a good time. And it was really not my wife's idea. So that's why we ended up in San Diego, basically. In any case, a lot of miles under the bridge, water under the bridge, I should say.
It's hearing that story is just because all you hear is people want to know how, and sure, a lot of our listeners definitely want to know that you've discussed it before, how the spike proteins, how it enters the cell and the breakdown of everything. But hearing that side of you is it's an amazing story. It's when you coming from that background, going into laboring, we it's like bricklayers, we call it laboring here, but you guys call it building there.
Yeah.
And coming from that background, going across the country, moving from one place to another place, I follow a lot of the Stoic philosophy of, not so much attachment to hold calmness, because if you attach yourself to too much, it's actually won't make you calm, because the idea of losing that stresses you out even more. So by you moving around and it shows a lot of humility as well, which is it's something that you laugh. Is it? Am I wrong? Am I wrong in saying that? Did I say something wrong?
No, no. It's so humility. So when I was young, I was a bit arrogant.
Right. Okay.
Who I am now has been sanded down through a lot of hard times. I mean, there's been times when I've been really poor. There was a time when I was so poor, I was literally living off roadkill. I understand poverty, and I understand hard times. And I got to say also, I've lived in Switzerland and Bern. There's a Heinlein book. You're probably not a science fiction buff. You asked how come this is another part of who I am, is I'm a big fan of cyberpunk, like Bruce Sterling, and those guys. I used to burn through science fiction like nobody's business when I was a young man. So my wife still reads science fiction, fantasy all the time. So that forces you to kind of stretch your brain a little bit.
Definitely.
But so there's this title from Heinlein, back older generation sci-fi, Stranger in a Strange Land.
Okay.
And I kind of feel like that describes who I am a little bit. The culture that my wife and I came from in Santa Barbara really no longer exists. Right. It kind of all got changed when Ronald Reagan, who had his farm just a few miles down the road from where I grew up, when he came on, in Santa Barbara, all got changed in Goleta and everything, all went upscale. It got the world's attention. Now we have the prince and his wife lives in Montecito, and all of that, right? It was always a refuge for the LA elite, but the kind of the social contract was that in the culture I grew up with was that you don't gawk, and they come to Santa Barbara to fit in, not to be stars. If they want to be stars, they can go to Las Vegas or other places, hang out in Hollywood. They come to Montecito and Santa Barbara and the Central Coast to kind of just live their lives. People like Jackson Brown, and a lot of the Laurel Canyon music elite. And so that was the culture back then, but now it's become, America's Riviera. Yeah. When we go back, it's not what it was. And when we go to Switzerland or Portugal or wherever, we just embrace the local culture. We're not part of it. It's not part of us. We just kind of go with the flow. And likewise here in Virginia. So you're right. It all teaches humility.
Yes.
And if you want to get along with people, and I pride myself on being able to talk to everybody. I try really hard not to come across as talking down to people.
Yeah.
And sometimes people object to that on Twitter. They're like, why don't you make this simple for me and whatever? I'm like, no, I'm trying to enable you to think.
Yes.
And to have the information to think for yourself and not talk down to you to say, this is what you should think, but rather to give you the tools to allow you to do your own thinking. That's a win for me. There's a phrase, I'm deeply wired as a leader because I lead teams and stuff. But I'm a weird one. I'm not an authoritarian. I'm what they call a servant leader. So I lead by example and I lead by enabling others.
Best leadership.
And it comes from that place of humility of recognizing, having been poor, having been hungry, recognizing that whether or not you're a farmhand or a full professor, everybody deserves respect. And another thing that's really fundamental bedrock for me, and I've posted this a few times on Twitter, there's this book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by a guy named Thomas Kuhn. And it was super influential for me. That book and another one is Victims of Groupthink. But Structure of Scientific Revolutions is the book that gave us the words paradigm shift, that whole logic.
Yes.
And what it teaches, if you look at the history of science and technology, is that most frequently of all the places in all the kind of intellectual spaces that drive innovation, it almost always comes from outsiders, not from insiders. So for instance, when I get somebody new, when I was running a laboratory and I'd get somebody new come into my laboratory group, I knew that there was about 3 months where those people would be able to see things that the rest of us wouldn't because they aren't all wrapped up in the paradigm. They could see stuff. And this is how come outsiders often are innovators, is because they don't have the biases of the people that are already on the inside. And so what that teaches, as far as I'm concerned, is that outsiders usually don't have the special language. They don't have the secret decoder ring, but they can often see things and experience things and know things in a fundamental way that insiders can't see or know. And if you're somebody who cares about innovation, you darn well better listen to those people, even though they may not have the fancy degrees and have the card carrying special knowledge and fancy words. A lot of times they can see stuff that you can't see, and so it would be stupid, counterproductive, to not listen to what they have to say. And that kind of extends to everything in my life. Is as a scientist, I go through the world saying, hey, I don't have the answers. I have hypotheses. I have all this training. But what all that training teaches me is, to a significant extent, how little we really know. So if I can finish with one thought on this point, I used to collect old medical textbooks. And as a physician, the thing about collecting old medical textbooks is that really teaches humility, because you ought to read the stuff that was in those old books, where they're just absolute. They use as much assurance and confidence in what they say about crazy ideas that they do now. It's the same words, and it kind of emphasizes that, the awareness. Biology is really, really complicated. Virology is really complicated. And vaccinology is really complicated. And we really don't know that much. And we like to think that we're big expert specialists, but as soon as we tell ourselves we're the experts and we have all the answers, is when we start making really stupid mistakes. So there's my comments about humility.
And I appreciate them very much. Me, myself, I resonate with a lot of that. I came from a farm and went to the favelas of Brazil, ended up here in Australia in this weird media space where I'm speaking to CEOs, protest organizers, mothers, fathers, doctors, geniuses like yourself. And it's the whole expert argument that's being toted right now is an interesting one. And it's interesting that you put it in that way, that from the outsider's perspective coming in, because they're shunning down a lot of people at the minute. And you articulated it brilliantly just then, and you're the inventor of mRNA technology. If we do not allow for outsiders' perspective, how can we look at and find alternatives if we're only seeing this through one lens? For example, in Australia, it's either this vaccine or you can't get out of your house to go. You got to show it at a coffee shop. You got to show
that is so wrong.
Do this and that. It's unbelievable. Is that innovation moving away when they're trying to say there is only one way?
There's a whole nother hour of discussion we could have right around that one comment you just made.
My apologies. I do need to get you on the. I know. You're a busy man. I know. And people are going to be annoyed. Why didn't you talk about cells and particular items? I know.
But let's open that for a moment. Let's talk about that. Okay. Peter Navarro, who used to work for the Trump administration, he was responsible for sourcing hydroxychloroquine and a lot of other things early on. And I have been working together, and we've put out 2 opinion pieces in the Washington Times. And if you're following my Twitter feed, you've probably seen them.
Yes.
One of them just dropped, I think, 2 days ago. I think I just posted it yesterday. And what we lay out is what we believe, and it's not, I didn't come up with this. It reflects the thinking of many people, not the least of which is Gert Vandenbosch. So I don't want to claim, I feel real burned about people that keep trying to take credit for my ideas. Mm-hmm. And that leaves me pretty focused on making sure that I give credit to other people. So there's a lot of people that have gone into this thinking, not just me and not just Peter. But the logic is, and it tries to pull together in this middle space that we were talking about. It's not left or right, right? It's kind of in the in-between space. Are there alternative strategies? So the proposal we have weaves together the fact that we don't have unlimited vaccine. If you're living in Australia, which is relatively economically developed, but if you were living in Brazil or Peru or in the Pampas, in Argentina, you don't have vaccine. You don't have the money for vaccine. If you're living in the Central African Republic, you living in Central Africa, in any of those states in the malaria belt, you don't have money to go buy fancy mRNA vaccine and buy a whole bunch of freezers and all that kind of stuff. And so you got to think about what makes sense for you. And then you've got the Director General of the WHO saying, hey, Western nations, you're hoarding all the good stuff. You're hoarding all the goodies. You're not sharing. And that's not right. Now, here in the States, we say, stuff it, go pound sand. We came up with it and we get to use it, and I don't care. If you look right now, when I'm on podcasts with people from Latin America or Africa, one of the things they're saying to me is, hey, from where we stand, this looks like more U.S. economic imperialism.
Right. Okay.
You guys are hoarding all the goodies. The Director General of the WHO, not a man generally considered to be a hero in this outbreak, and often referred to as a another set of vocal cords for Bill Gates.
Yes.
There's a case to be made along those lines, but he's saying that the West should be sharing vaccine.
A big case.
Yeah. So he's saying that the West should be sharing vaccine and protecting the elders in all of these other places. Bill has made a big deal about saving lives. But if he's really caring about saving lives, why aren't we making vaccine available? Why isn't he buying Pfizer and forcing Pfizer and Moderna, who he has big shares in, to make their product available to Central African nations and Latin American nations and Indonesia and other places that are impoverished, so they can protect their elders? So what Peter and I propose, and by the way, this also reflects, as I mentioned, Gert Vandenbosch's thinking. Universal vaccination is going to drive the development of vaccine-resistant mutant viruses. Now, Australia's got a strong livestock, experience and cultural awareness. You guys understand that giving antibiotics to cows and feedlots or chickens or whatever drives the evolution of superbugs.
Yes.
Vaccines, universal vaccination, especially when it's not necessary, will drive the development of vaccine escape mutants. And when that happens, when we get a super virus that is able to bypass the immunosurveillance and selective pressure of spike vaccines, who's going to die? Okay. It's the elderly and the high risk.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we're doing is, to many eyes, including mine, just darn stupid. We're wasting the one tool that we've got to protect the people most vulnerable by mandating vaccination on everybody. And now we have the data showing that natural immunity is about 20-fold better in terms of protection from death and disease and durability than vaccine-mediated immunity, okay? And your probability of dying, here in the States, we have one of the worst records in terms of mortality, by the way. We like to tell ourselves we have the best medicine. The data aren't showing that, okay? Overuse of dexamethasone may be one problem. But we're not managing our cases very well. We're absolutely blocked from early treatment. We've got the government trashing both hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which the rest of the world is using liberally. Not all nations, but for instance, in Mexico, you buy ivermectin over the counter and it's cheap.
Yes.
They're using it in India, they're using it in Indonesia, it goes on and on, Vietnam. So here the government is actively blocking availability of ivermectin. They're not just not making it available. They're running a major campaign to try to discredit it, calling it a horse drug, which is, patently absurd.
That is, sorry, not to cut you off, but that's exactly what's happening here. We're having a massive push by the mainstream media to try and discredit ivermectin, saying it's a horse drug, it's the worm drug, but ivermectin's been around for over 40 years. It's been administered billions and billions and billions of times on humans. It's had multiple tests and data have proven it to work fine on humans. It's not just for animals. To my understanding, you also had a company that looked at repurposing drugs, and one of those drugs was ivermectin. Am I right?
And I've administered it to myself under prescription from another physician for my long COVID. Something people need to recognize is that I was infected very early in the outbreak in late February of 2020. and I developed long COVID. So when I talk about COVID and these other things, it's not theoretical for me. I've lived it.
Yeah.
And so is my wife. So I had clinical benefit from my long COVID. Many others that I know report clinical benefit with ivermectin.
Joe Rogan came out. He's come out and
Joe Rogan, your doppelganger here in the United States.
I can only hope to ever be even mentioned as the same sentence. So I do appreciate it. He is a great mentor, but please go on.
Yeah. So here's the 4-pronged strategy that I would advise your government. Not that they're going to call me up tomorrow, but it could be that other politicians in Australia might reach out to me. But I wouldn't be able to discuss that on your show. But it might happen. Just saying.
They are nosy, the government over here. I tell you what.
Yeah, we'll have to make sure what we say so you don't get whacked.
Yeah, watch out. The government is wild.
So 4-pronged strategy. It's basically personalized medicine, a modern concept. Okay, so let's get out of the 20th century where I like to say you probably are too young to have kids. I've raised 2 boys. And I love the phrase, if you give a 3-year-old a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And this is true with RNA vaccines, it seems. And so they just want to bang every nail in with the same hammer. But it doesn't have to be that way.
Yes.
Okay. So what Peter Navarro and I advocate is, number one, use the vaccines for the people that need it most, the people at highest risk. Number 2, make drugs available, allow physicians to practice medicine. Good God. Talk about common sense.
Yes. Yes. We're missing that somehow. We lost it somehow. We need it back.
Physicians generally, not politicians, but physicians are the ones that have been through this stupid long training to learn how to treat patients. Why don't we let them treat patients, please?
Yes.
And there are many drug combinations and protocols using existing drugs that are dirt cheap. You don't have to use fancy new stuff from Pfizer and Merck. They're ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, famotidine, celecoxib, fluvoxamine. The list goes on and on and on.
Yes.
And I'm sorry to say, I don't like the idea very much, but there's evidence now that certain anti-androgens work really good in the hospital. But they're temporary, thank heavens. Folks like yourself can appreciate what I'm saying.
Yes.
Vaccinate the ones that really need it, not everybody, because you're just driving the development of escape mutants by doing otherwise. And plus it's not ethical.
Yes.
You're hoarding all the goodies. Okay. Share. Don't be stupid. Number 2, early drug treatment, let physicians practice medicine. There are plenty of early treatment protocols. You want to get that treatment on board as soon as possible. Keep people out of the hospital. Okay. The goal here is not to fix them once they're on death's door, when all the damage is done. The goal is to keep them out of the hospital.
Yes.
So that means early treatment, get it through your brain.
Yes.
This is easy stuff. Okay. Every one of your listeners can figure this out by themselves. Okay. In the States, we do this business. They go to the hospital. They say, I'm sick, doc. I'm having problems breathing. They check their blood oxygen. They say, it's not bad enough yet. Go home and come back when you're really sick, when your lips are blue. Okay. That's just dumb. That's not good medicine. I don't know how we got there. It's bloody crazy. Number 3, in order for folks to know whether or not they're high risk for vaccine, and I understand you guys have got something in your constitution that says that people have the right to not be subjected to medical procedures unless they want to. Now, Am I correct on that?
Yes, they can't make this mandatory, only through the coercion of businesses and trying to fine businesses if their employees are not vaccinated, essentially trying to force businesses to put in their policy that their employees must be vaccinated with this COVID-19 vaccine. Otherwise, in this country, it cannot be mandatory.
So you're even better off than we are. Okay, that's fundamental Nuremberg Code stuff, Helsinki Accords. It's fundamental human rights, guys. Get with the program. Okay, people have the right to choose. I'm getting worked up now.
That's fine.
Okay,
that's fine.
But
few of our leaders need to hear this.
People need the ability to figure out what their risk is. They also, by the way, need full and transparent disclosure what the risks of vaccine are, not this half-baked, we're not going to really tell you, little children, because you can't handle the truth stuff, okay? Yes. That is the noble lie, okay? Let's stop that crazy stuff. Let's be honest. People deserve to know the truth about what the risks are, and then they can make an informed decision about whether or not it makes sense for them, rather than just line up, bend over, and take the jab and start giving me, stop and shut up. Or we're going to herd all the kids into the whole stadium full of kids thing really lit up the whole world. That was bad atmospherics. Somebody deserves to lose their job over that decision.
100%.
In my opinion.
In my humble opinion as well.
So you got to give people the tools to figure out what their true risk is. Oh, we don't have those. BS. Okay. We do have those. Okay. There are many tools that you can load up on your cell phone, and you can type in what your characteristics are, and they'll tell you what your risk of severe COVID and death are. And by the way, for somebody like you, the probability that you're going to die from COVID is about 0.0001%. Okay. So I'm an old fart. Okay. I got COVID. It hit me hard. And it was at a time when there was nothing out there. I self-treated. That's how I discovered famotidine. Okay. But I got hit hard, and I was sure that my lungs were just going to be shot to, where. And I had kind of come to accommodate that reality that my body was messed up, and I was never going to have the stamina I used to have. I just finished my pulmonary function testing. Guess what? I'm good to go. I'm within normal limits for a 61-year-old old fart. Okay. And I had COVID hard. Okay. So it's not a death sentence, guys. Don't let the press, scare you with all this fear porn. Just say no. Look at the numbers. Look at the facts. That's why I post those links and that information about what your true risks are. Okay. Know what your true risks are. Because if you're not one of those high risk groups and you're not 80 years old, and you're not morbidly obese, I don't think you look morbidly obese myself. Your probability of death and disease and going to the hospital is poquito, if you forgive my saying. It's tiny.
I love the Brazilian. There we go. The Portuguese comes out. It comes out. Love it. Yes.
So don't let them scare you. The scare is about pushing you around and controlling you. The last part to make this work, okay, is you have got to have the ability to test at home to figure out if you've got real infection, or if you have respiratory syncytial virus, or you got rhinovirus, or you got allergies because they're plowing the field next to you, or whatever the heck it is, okay? You got to have ability to test at home so that when you start to come down with that cough and that feeling of shortness of breath or whatever, you can pull out your little handy dandy test kit or go down to the pharmacy and get one or whatever, and figure out, is it real or is it just your paranoia?
Yeah.
So that you know whether or not you got to get to the doc and start taking those early drugs. So 4 things. Number 1, vaccinate the elderly, not everybody, because you're just driving the development of worse virus. Number 2, if you vaccinate everybody. Number 2, early treatments and let docs treat patients. Come on, guys. Number 3, allow tools that you can load onto your laptop or onto your cell phone or whatever that you can figure out what your true risk is. At this point, I don't trust the government. I suspect you don't either. And I don't want to give them all my medical data. No. But something that's on my cell phone that's private, that allow me to calculate my risk, that works for me. And by the way, it makes it so we don't have to have a massive database and have, the bad guys creeping into it and finding out all our information. And number 4, we got to make test kits available, even if they have high false positive rates, so that people have a reasonable, the way it works in clinical testing is your screening test has a high false positive. It's going to happen. Okay. And then you do a follow-up test. If you come in, it says positive, then you do a confirmatory test that's more specific, and then you make a decision about whether or not to treat. Okay. So those 4 simple things is going to totally change the landscape. It's personalized medicine. It empowers you. You're in control, not the state. Okay. The big bosses aren't telling you what to do. And as I understand it, that is totally aligned with the Australian Constitution, which says it's your body, it's your right to decide what puts into it and what doesn't get put into it. And the state doesn't have the right to tell me what I have to do with my body. And that's where I get to this point about individual rights versus the collective.
Yes.
And all this talk about, we got to get the jabs to protect the old folks. If the old folks decide not to take vaccine and they die, that's their decision. Okay. I'm not responsible for them. Just like they're not responsible for me. If my tractor tips over into the creek and I get smushed, do I blame it on Kubota? No, I blame it on me getting too close to the creek. Yes. Right? It's my choice.
Yes, 100%. And I fully agree with that sentiment. They're doing a massive push right now for the kids, and children should not be even close to the conversation of these COVID-19 vaccinations.
Amen.
At all.
Hallelujah.
And
you're preaching to the choir.
And and when you just said just then that everyone should be essentially responsible for their own health, I just want to touch on a few points, and I understand you're busy and I'll let you get back to it. Just a few important points that I want to finish off with. In saying that, everyone being responsible for their own health, people would combat that and say, well, you are going to be spreading it, which then sort of derails the fact if it's everything's working, so right? It's working.
Thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so that was the logic of a month ago.
Okay. See, I told you we're a little behind. The waves ripple down to Australia.
That logic doesn't work anymore. Okay. Because Delta, and by the way, we've got new ones coming on, Lambda and Mu,
yes,
that are even more resistant to the vaccine. Okay. Delta blows through the vaccination. Your protection from infection and virus replication is about 60% on a good day. Some studies say 40%. Okay. With the vaccination. So the vaccines are not what we call, now this doesn't have anything to do with your reproductive health. That's another question. The vaccines are not sterilizing, is the word we use as vaccinologists, in the sense that they don't block the ability of the virus to replicate in your body. Okay, so that's the sterilization that we're talking about here, okay? Not your ability to have a baby, okay? So the vaccines are not sterilizing. And they're leaky. That is the technical term. They're leaky vaccines. They're actually quite leaky. And it's getting worse because of the vaccine escape mutants that we're selecting. Okay. So Pfizer has said that they think that the current generation vaccines may no longer really be very effective 6 months from now. The virus is evolving really, really fast. Okay, so think about it. You give Grandma Jones the jab, or you take the jab. Okay, because your business says you got to take the jab, or otherwise they're going to fire you. That's what happens.
A lot is happening right now.
Okay, so you take the jab. Let's say because you don't run a podcast. Got to be out on
construction right now. Construction is a big thing. Coercion for construction, since it's a big industry in Australia.
So let's say you're a construction worker and you take the jab. What does that mean? If you come in contact with somebody who has virus and you've got at least a 40% chance, if you got a good robust contact, you go to the bar and it's a little bit of kissy with the girl next door to you, and she happens to be shedding virus. And by the way, she doesn't even know she's infected because she's had the jab and it protects from disease. Okay. So it doesn't protect from infection very good, but it protects from disease better. So she's walking around basically as a super spreader. Okay. And you get real friendly in the bar. Okay, so there's a little exchange of body fluids one way or another. And now you've got the virus because it wasn't perfectly protective. Okay. And your risk of getting that virus with these strains, if you get a good inoculum, is about 40%. In other words, if 4 out of 10 people are going to get infected. Okay. The other 6, or maybe it's 8 out of, maybe it's 6 out of 10 are going to get infected. Depends on which study you look at. Okay. But there's a pretty reasonable chance you're going to get infected. Okay. Then what? Well, the data are very clear. You will replicate virus in your body at least the same level and have it in your nose and in your mouth at least the same level as somebody who didn't get the jab.
Yes.
Okay. And then the probability is that your ability to transmit to somebody else next time you go to that bar or wherever, if you're this hypothetical construction guy, or the guys that you're hanging around at lunchtime with, or whatever the thing is, right?
Yes.
And you cough or you share French fries or whatever that happens, or you shake their hand after having eaten your dinner or whatever. You're going to be perfectly able to infect them because you're making just as much virus as a guy that didn't get the jab. Okay. So it's the CDC, US CDC has done, they leaked a slide deck, an internal slide deck a few weeks ago.
Yes.
Somebody, a whistleblower, gave it to the Washington Post. Okay. And it's a complicated slide deck. You got to kind of have the secret decoder ring for epidemiology to figure it out. But it very clearly shows that the infectivity of this virus is wicked high. It's an R naught of 8, as opposed to an R naught of, say, 2 to 3 for the alpha variant. Okay, so it's way more infectious. It replicates at something like 200 times the level that alpha and beta did. Once you're infected, it doesn't matter whether you've been jabbed or not about how much virus you make. It actually, if you've had the jab, it makes it more likely that you're not going to go to bed and lick your wounds for a week, but rather still be on that construction site because you're partially protected from disease. So you're not feeling as sick, but you're still making lots of virus. You're still shedding that virus. You're still at risk for infecting everybody else. And by the way, it's only good for 6 months.
Yes. That's
so, if think back in your days, in Brazil,
yes,
or as we were talking about, imagine you're in Peru, or a lot of other places on the high pampas, and this is an expensive vaccine. And you got to have a cold chain, which, as we were discussing, I've done a vaccine project for PATH in Brazil. cold chain and getting it out into you talked about favelas, out in the surrounding, we could gently call them suburbs, around the main cities, that would be giving them too much credit.
Yeah, I think so. But sure, we'll run with it.
Their idea there of a cold chain is somebody with a bike and a freezer pack sitting in the basket on the back, right? Yeah. And that's on a good day, right? That's high tech. This is just totally impractical. And the gods, our overlords here. I'm sorry, I'm getting worked up.
No, it's fine.
Our overlords are just, I don't know what Kool-Aid they've drunk. This is just crazy.
Does it affect
this does not make sense.
Does it affect your natural immune system? For example, if you've got a vaccine against Delta and another variant comes along.
So that's a good question. And a lot of people are asking it. Does the vaccine have an adverse event? I can tell you one thing it does do, and this is not official yet. So the fact checkers will all say, "Oh, but there's nothing that proves that that's the case." Well, I can tell you, my buddies at FDA know that this is one of the major risk factors and complications. It's just not official yet. Okay, but it was in the New England Journal of Medicine paper out of Israel comparing the risks of infection versus the risks of vaccine with Delta. Just recently, like 2 weeks ago, it was published. Okay. So one of the key adverse events that occurs is called viral reactivation. Well, viral reactivation, we're talking about shingles and herpes and Epstein-Barr virus and cytomegalovirus and a lot of other stuff that is sitting hidden under control in our body. Okay. So for instance, I picked up a wicked bad Epstein-Barr virus when I was a graduate student. That's a whole nother story. I mean, cytomegalovirus. I got cytomegalovirus hepatitis because I was doing co-cultivation experiments looking at cytomegalovirus and the AIDS virus interactions. And they wouldn't let me use the full bioprotection by turning on the hoods because they thought I would blow HIV out the stacks and infect everybody in La Jolla. So that's a personal part of my story, another one. And I got this wicked bad CMV infection because I was working with the hottest strain of CMV that was available at the time. And CMV is bad business, and it affects about half of the people in the world, and it drives your immune system to increasingly focus on suppressing CMV. And it's probably a major cause of the phenomena that we call immunosenescence. That's a fancy way of saying old people's immune systems get burned out, okay? Because they're busy fighting the same viruses that are sitting there just waiting to jump out and attack us if there's some sort of danger signal, okay? And these vaccines flip on those viruses. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean they're flipping on those viruses because they're suppressing the immune response that's otherwise keeping those viruses in control? Or is it because they're causing upregulation of certain inflammatory cytokines that are telling those viruses a danger signal that says, hey, you better jump ship right now. Viruses are like rats on the ship, okay? And when they think that it's time to get off ship, they will jump out and look for another place to make it oversimplified. And that, there's all kinds of cool molecular biology and virology and signal transduction pathways and NF-kappa B and blah, 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 blah. But the bottom line is that they got cool ways to figure out when bad stuff is happening to their host and get the signal to get out of Dodge. And that's happening after vaccination. Now, so is it because of the vaccines producing some immunosuppression? Is it because of the vaccines upregulating inflammatory markers? I don't know. I just know it's happening.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there evidence? I know for sure that the virus is really tweaking our immune systems. It's not so bad as AIDS, but it's profoundly affecting things called T regulatory cells that control our whole immune response.
Is that the reason why? Is that
the answer?
Possibly why Sweden has rejected any flights coming in from Israel? I believe they're the second EU nation to reject anyone from Israel, which is a high vaccinated nation.
So Jill ran that to ground. What's coming out of Sweden? So you're following my Twitter feed, and I raised that question. So my wife and partner Jill, who's also a PhD, and been a partner in this whole journey, since I mentioned, since she was 15 and I was 16. No, don't ask any more questions. So in any case, she ran that to ground, and the official justification is that what's going on in Israel is that there are these pockets. I think they call them Hasidic Jews, the fundamentalist in Israel, and they're generally an older population, and they really don't want to take vaccine. So there's islands in Israel of populations that are not taking vaccine.
Yes,
and they're getting hammered. And so I think that's one explanation for part of what's going on in Israel right now. And it's something that's not picked up by the press, is that there are these populations of Israeli citizens that are of a fundamentalist orientation religiously, that just feel like it's not right to take vaccine into their bodies. And many of them are older, and they are just getting decimated by this Delta wave. So that's at least part of the explanation that Sweden is offering, is that there are a number of Israelis that clearly, no matter what you say, whatever the explanation, there's a large fraction of the Israeli population, even the vaccinated, that are getting infected and having disease and ending up in the hospital. And as we've just discussed, the levels of virus in their bodies are no different from the levels of the ones that haven't taken the jab.
Yeah.
So is there something special going on in Israel? I don't know. That's just one explanation. But so that's apparently the official party line right now.
I have so many more questions, especially after that last statement.
I know.
However, the lab leak is an interesting one for me. I'm inclined to believe the lab leak due to the evolutionary adaptation of a virus. My understanding is that generally when virus is moving from one host to another, it's small, so it can't manifest at a rapid rate unless it already knows how to do that. So I'm inclined to believe the lab theory. However, I'm not too sure as to if it is or if it isn't, or...
So...
Yeah, please.
So the government on the lab leak, and then let's close on that.
Yes.
So here we go down the conspiracy rabbit hole.
Is it Robert Redfield? Is that the ex-CDC director, Dr. Robert Redfield? He
Yeah, I know Bob Redfield.
Yes. So I think that's
he works for Bob Gallo, has for years.
Yes.
Remember I was telling you about Bob Gallo earlier.
Yes.
Something to know about Bob Redfield is, so this is a fun small world thing. Bob Redfield got in trouble for basically misrepresenting data about the AIDS vaccine that he had developed.
Right.
And the protection was that he was observing was actually an artifact. And the Army took away his money, and he got in big trouble and got kicked out. My first big contract with the military was I managed to grab some of that money when I was a medical intern. About $1 million bucks, a little over $1 million. So that was my big contract for development of AIDS vaccines, DNA vaccines for AIDS. So Bob Redfield is a character, as is all these people are just characters. But in any case,
so you believe it's a conspiracy?
I touch these guys not in an inappropriate way. There is an interface socket between my world and the intelligence community. Let's just leave it at that. I am not CIA, but I have dealt with many CIA folk from time to time.
Yep.
And I'm deeply embedded and have been. I think none of them will talk to me now, in the world of biodefense and all of that. Actually, I still work on a DITRA contract.
Which is fair enough, as you should. You're a big part of this space and you're an intellect within it. So it makes sense that at some stage they would have reached out to you for some contract.
So that's just part of what I do. And it's only a part of what I do, but I do deal with these people. So there's a guy that I've co-published with for years named Michael Callahan. He is bona fide CIA, full stop. And you may have noticed that I posted a piece called DARPA's Man in Wuhan.
Yes.
From this interesting website called Unlimited Hangout that had been pulled off the web, but then it got put back on again. So Michael is an interesting character. I think a strong case can be made. He is the most experienced biowarfare specialist in the United States. He's been directly involved in gain-of-function research for years. And to call him DARPA, yes, he's worked for DARPA. He used to head a big program for DARPA. That's, let's say, an understatement of his role in the intelligence community, and leave it at that. Michael was in Wuhan. So I've been told that I'm not supposed to talk about this anymore, but I'm kind of like beyond caring. By senior people in the government, that officially we had nobody in country in the fourth quarter of 2019. Okay, so get that through your brain. There were no Americans in China in 2019 working for the government, period. You understand? Those are the truth. And yeah, news to me too, because Michael called me from Wuhan on January 4th of 2020 and said, Robert, you got to get your team spun up because this virus that you've been hearing about is a bad one. And we need you to get going on this. And I started screening repurposed drugs after having recreated the crystal structure of the papain-like protease when the sequence dropped, called the Wuhan seafood market virus on January 10th. Okay. And Michael went on to manage the Diamond Princess outbreak and a bunch of other things. He reported to a guy named Bob Kadlec, who is the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, who's another dark agency guy. So what I know is that our most senior, most experienced biowarfare specialists that we parachute into any major outbreak anywhere in the world was in China. And if you think I'm lying, you can look at his story, which is full of misrepresentations, but it was covered by Science Magazine as the original story for the discovery of famotidine, which I disagree with, but that's another thing. So Michael, by his own mouth, was in Wuhan in late 2019. And what he told the author of that story, Brendan Burrell, was he escaped Wuhan because he wasn't officially supposed to be there. He was under cover of his Harvard appointment. He escaped Wuhan as the curtain was coming down on the quarantine by boat. So, the Chinese, he wasn't like the Chinese government was like, oh, nice young man in white coat. I'm sorry to paraphrase, like the way I shouldn't do that. The Chinese government was not fully apprised that there was an American intelligence agency agent under cover of his Harvard appointment in Wuhan during late fourth quarter of 2019, but he was there. Okay. So when I hear the whole lab leak chatter, what I know is there's documentation about funding flowing from both DITRA and NIH to the Wuhan lab relating to gain-of-function research in coronaviruses. And as somebody who's worked at a primate research center, I can't distinguish between the possibility that somebody was selling carcasses or previously infected animals out the back door versus some lab tech got infected, which is, by the way, how come respiratory syncytial virus got into the in the world population. Okay, it was a lab leak just like this, where personnel got infected in Silver Spring, in DC, in the late 50s. It was working with primates. It's a crossover primate virus. So respiratory syncytial virus is another example of a well-documented lab leak. And I can't distinguish between, we don't have the data to say that this was an intentionally engineered or an unintentionally engineered or a lab leak or an infection of a lab personnel or a purposeful release, which a lot of people also believe. There's just no way to sort all that stuff out. And in a way, it kind of doesn't matter. The thing has all got us by the short and curlies now anyhow, right?
Yeah.
And what happened then, that's interesting and important, but no one is going to disclose it because the parties that touch that are the United States and China. They both touch it. And let's just imagine Tony Fauci's, Jesus comes to him in a dream and says, Tony, you got to come clean. Let's just imagine that as a thought experiment. And
that's
he
a tough
steps
imagination,
up,
but yeah.
and he,
but yes.
and he steps up and he says to the world, okay, you got me. I'm responsible. Let's say he said that just for a thought experiment. Okay. Yep. The legal impact on the United States government, not to mention the political impact, would be enormous.
Yes.
Because the US government would suddenly become liable for what's happened to the world. There's no way that either the US government or the Chinese government can come clean on this. They can't do it. Okay. And to expect them to do something like that is you're living in a fantasy. There's no way that they can do anything other than hide the information. And I'm sorry, this whole, we're going to get to the bottom of this and I'm going to have a report from the intelligence community, and the intelligence community comes back and says, oh, darn, we can't figure it out. Well, that's the end of it. Okay, they can't figure it out. Job done. I'm sorry, that doesn't work for me either. It's a little too convenient. But, that's the world we're in. This is the last thing I can tell you about that.
Yeah.
Okay. There is a hole in the biowarfare treaty.
Okay.
The biowarfare treaty prevents the development of lethal agents. It doesn't prevent the development of incapacitating agents.
Right.
Okay. And the deployment of incapacitating agents. What is an incapacitating agent? It's something that makes you so sick that you're not going to go grab your gun. You got no will to fight. Okay. That's an incapacitating agent. That is not prohibited in the biowarfare treaty. And the people in my world know that fact. Okay. So I'll leave you with that.
That just blew my mind. Dr. Robert Malone, thank you so much for giving us your time. It's been a pleasure and an absolute honor on our end. You're a great mind and a one of a kind in this world of ours. It was great to get to know you from at a deeper level, your past and your passions and where you come from. And hopefully we can do this face to face sooner than later. And what I've got from this is Australia, no 80%, no coercion in the workforce, no COVID-19 vaccines for children. And let's get back to the data and the science. Dr. Robert Malone, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Be good.